Welcome back again to Archaeology After Dark. I'm, of course, your awesome host, Daniel Rhodes. My guest this week is Sarah Bowser. Sarah, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be able to talk about some wildlife and other really cool things with you today.
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit about yourself before we get started.
So, I am a naturalist and wildlife educator. I have been teaching communities about wildlife for about the past 7 years. And I originally taught a lot in the Southeast. I was actually born in Alabama, but grew up in Georgia. And so I'm from there and recently relocated to California. So I've taught about wildlife literally from kind of coast to coast. And I usually teach about native wildlife. So rather than talking about, lions and tigers and cheetahs and things that you find around the world, I tend to focus a lot on wildlife that we actually find here in the United States, often the ones that you're going to come into contact with or see in your own backyard, and how we can kind of neutralize any tensions that we feel with local wildlife and help us learn a little bit more about them so we can appreciate them just a little bit more. And be better neighbors with wildlife. So that is kind of my job. And I usually teach whether it's kids, adults, everybody in between. And one of my favorite parts of my job is I actually get to oftentimes teach with wildlife, teach with ambassador animals. I've handled things as teeny tiny as, smaller insects, really small invertebrates, all the way up to alligators. We've talking, hawks, owls, everything in between, a lot of snakes, a lot of lizards. Those are animals I've gotten the chance to work with and handle directly. And we use those ambassador animals to help with just general education through community and help people feel a little less nervous, or hopefully people are able to tolerate wildlife a little bit more if they were really against them in the beginning. And so that's kind of what my job is now. And I've done that for a variety of facilities and institutions, whether they are nature centers. I've worked with wildlife rehabilitation clinics, museums, local governments, all of them. You can usually use wildlife education in kind of any facet there.
Right, and that brings us to what we're actually going to talk about today. We, as a lot of you know, archaeologists, we prefer to work outdoors. If you're doing it indoors, that's problematic for a number of reasons. You're making holes in the floor of your house and your wall, things like that. You don't want to do that. So what advice would you give for people who are, first starting out? You spend a lot of time outdoors. What advice would you give people, when they're out in the field interacting with nature?
Yeah, so one of the first advice I would give for you, especially now, is, education is going to be your biggest benefit and tool. So learning, if you're going out and like, even if you do have some fears about whatever you might find out there, whether it's plants or animals, kind of knowing what you're looking at out there, whether you want to touch it or, check it out even a little bit more, it's going to be really important. And so whether it is getting, field guides, whether they're based on local plants, southeastern trees, reptiles, anything, field guides, or even getting apps on your phone like iNaturalist or Merlin, which is through Cornell, help you identify birds. Having that's one of the first things I always recommend to people is the more confident you feel to identify what you're looking at, the more knowledge you have to understand what you're looking at, and the less fear and the less stress you might have, right? So when you're going out and trying to enjoy a hike, which is one thing I really love doing, it's one of those rare opportunities that I get to go out and interact with wildlife and not actually have to teach about them at the same time. It's really great to be able to walk out and know, okay, I'm looking at this, is this poison oak? Is this poison ivy? Is this potentially venomous snake? Do you get closer? Do you stand back? Just kind of being able to understand those things. And when you're able to just identify even just a little bit, I feel like that usually calms down a lot of fears, especially, for example, with people who are like, oh, I'm really nervous about snakes whenever I go on a hike. And you say, okay, well, if we can tell the difference between these ones and these ones, you don't have to know anything really else about them except for, okay, if I see this one, I'm not so worried because I know it's not this, I know it's not one I might be more afraid of. So my first advice would just be take some time with field guides, again, whether they're in person, books in your hand, if you prefer that, because they have really cool pictures and so much information about them, or even apps on the phone, on your phone to help you identify them. Having that will be really beneficial to you. And the second thing that I would recommend, if it's just for recreation, which doesn't necessarily help as much with archaeology. If you're going out, you're not going to be staying on trail, but if you are just recreating and just hanging out at a national park or somewhere else, staying to trails will be your best bet. You're actually going to reduce the odds of you like running into some wildlife or, accidentally stepping on somebody in an area that's basically created for you to be there and to walk there. I was an interpretive ranger in Atlanta, Georgia, and I helped manage a 65-acre old growth forest. And that was one of the things that we always recommended people, because we had a really healthy copperhead population in our forest. And we had signs that say, hey, there are copperheads here. Just so we also had coyotes. We had a lot of animals that were there. And people would always say, oh, I'm really nervous. And like, if you stay on the trail, I promise you'll be all right. If you go off the trail and you go down the hill into all the leaf litter and doing something else, that's going to increase your chance of finding some different animals. But if you're ever nervous about it, staying on the trail is going to be your best bet. But yeah, just, trusting your own ability. If you're really nervous, stay on the trail. And then of course, keeping things to be able to help you identify what you're looking at. That way we're not stoking any kind of false fear when there's no reason to be, or blaming an animal that won't hurt you. And honestly, most of the animals are going to be more afraid of you than you are of them. So
Yeah, that's some advice I've always gotten, even when I wasn't, out being an archaeologist, just out in the woods with, the Boy Scouts or whatever. They will tell you that animals are more afraid of you than you are of them. So, just be careful and watch where you're going, really.
yeah, usually if you just watch where you're stepping, you'll be fine, because you also have to think about it, not even necessarily if some people are like, oh, well, maybe they're not afraid of me. You can also think of it as, for them, interacting with you could be potentially deadly on their end. So it's a survival tactic. Most wildlife, if they can avoid interaction with you overall, that increases their chance of survival. And so if they have that option to get away, if they don't feel like they have to defend themselves, they're just going to go. And so that's sometimes the best thing you can do is, if you see one, maybe step back, make sure they have a route to get out. And just stay calm throughout the process, because they want to survive and they're not going to interact with you, because that just increases their risk of dying or potentially dying. And so you just have to kind of remember it that way, that they want to survive too. And if they interact with it, just increases their chance it could go really wrong.
Yeah. So the next phase of this episode, I made a very crude PowerPoint presentation. I wasn't sure if anyone would actually be able to see it. So I just went with a basic black and white screen with some pictures of the animals that, I've seen or people have told me they've seen while they're working in the field. And we're going to go through a list. I think it's about 10 or so. And we're just going to talk about them.
Sounds good.
All right. Can you see that okay?
Yep.
All right. So the first two are going to be the ones that people are, I think, personally are bothered by the most, or they're most nervous about. And those are going to be the two venomous snakes and that they find here in Alabama. So you want to start with the copperhead?
Right. So these two, whenever you kind of mentioned to me that these were some of the wildlife we want to talk about, I was really happy that we're going to be talking about these kind of two species of snakes in particular. So copperheads, they are pit vipers. And so what that means is that they're going to have these heat-seeking pits here on the front of their face that are going to help them kind of catch their prey. You can always identify copperheads with this. You can kind of see in the picture when they get called, when you read them in a description, they're called like hourglass, like crossbands, because when you're looking at them from up above, it kind of looks like an X. When you look at them from the side, and you can see it really well in this picture, I like to say that it looks like a Hershey kiss on the side. That is a way that you can identify what these snakes will look like. They're the only ones that are going to have this kind of Hershey kiss marking there, or if you're looking at it from above, it looks like an hourglass with a Hershey kiss kind of on each side. So that's a way that you're able to identify them. They're going to be thicker bodied snakes, a little bit heavier, and they usually do have those kind of cat-eye pupils. That way they are pretty widespread throughout the eastern and central United States. And they are opportunistic feeders. They might be out during the day. They're usually out a little bit more at night, kind of foraging and hunting that way. And one of the things with copperheads, they are so good at camouflage. They're really good at it. As I mentioned, when I was a ranger in Georgia, we had a really healthy copperhead population. I knew we had a healthy copperhead population. I half the time did not see them anywhere. They hid from me extremely well when I was looking for them. And so they're really great about it. Now, whenever they are really young, juveniles, one thing that's really cool about them is that they will have that same pattern, but the tip of their tail is going to be like a highlighter fluorescent yellow. So you can tell the juveniles because they do have that color there. And it's actually really cool, but it is like a highlighter, like neon yellow kind of green color. So you can tell the juveniles that way. Now, copperheads do like to mate in the spring. And so you might have some more action kind of during that time. And I will say, this part will sound scary, but then I promise it's going to make it a lot better. Now, copperheads, due to their ability to camouflage, they are extremely good at it. They, I believe, are responsible for the majority of snake bites in the southeastern US. Now, they're responsible for the majority of them. However, their venom is really not potent. They are venomous, but that potency is not that much. So even if you were to get bit by copperhead, the odds of you even needing anti-venom, you won't. You'll be all right, unless you have a really severe allergic reaction, which again is extremely rare. Even if you got bit by a copperhead, you know, our understanding was just like, you might have to get some extra fluids, maybe have some Benadryl and antihistamine or something like that. But the majority of the time, you're going to be just fine. So even though they are venomous, their potency is not that severe. And with copperheads, usually what you have to do is just make sure, you know, you watch where you're going. They, despite what some people might say, you know, research says they're not a super aggressive snake. These are snakes that are really, again, only going to bite if they feel like they have to. So if you accidentally step on them, that's usually when that happens. And that's just because they're really good at camouflaging. So making sure, you know, we watch where we're going as best you can. Avoid stepping on them. Picking them up, obviously, is something that we don't necessarily want to do if you want to avoid a potential negative interaction with them. But usually if you're able to kind of keep your space from them, give them their space, and don't make them feel like they're in extreme danger, like picking them up or stepping on them, you're going to be fine. And then even if you do accidentally have an interaction with them where you might accidentally step on them, if you do get bit, whenever you're bit by any snake, it's really important that you try to identify that snake as best that you can, because that's going to kind of determine if you really, what kind of treatment that you need. For example, if you are bit by a copperhead or a water moccasin, you're going to be okay. If you are bit by a rattlesnake, odds are you're going to need anti-venom that way. So that's kind of different depending on the snake you're bit by. So again, that's why I say one of the great things you can do whenever you start venturing out is getting some of those identification skills down. Again, whether it's through a field guide, whether it's through an app on your phone. If you can see the snake when you get bit, if you have presence mind, maybe take a picture if you have to do it that way, whatever you need to do. But having that kind of knowledge there with you can really be helpful in making sure you get the treatment that you need. But if you are bit by a copperhead, you're going to be all right. Overall, you're going to be okay.
Yeah, I had a coworker he technically fell on it while he was in the field, and he really just had to spend the night in the hospital, and he was good the next day. He complained about it for the next week and a half, but he was fine really. But still, you want to avoid getting bitten if possible.
Yeah, you always want to avoid being bit. And I'll say when we talk about bites with species like copperhead, it won't be fun. It's going to swell and it's going to hurt, and it's not going to be an enjoyable experience, but it also won't necessarily be a life-threatening experience. And so we still want to avoid it. You don't want to like play with them just to test out what happens. But usually you see people that might stay under observation, making sure that we're getting fluids. It's probably going to swell, but you'll be okay most of the time. Again, unless you have a severe allergic reaction, overall, we'll be all right.
Okay. Well, I think that covers us on this one. Let's move to the next one. The water moccasin or cottonmouth.
Yeah, so water moccasins are pretty cool. Water moccasins and copperheads are in the same genus. So they're relatively kind of related to each other that way. And so again, when we're talking about water moccasins or cottonmouths, again, their venom potency isn't as high as it is in a rattlesnake. So even if you got bit, I think theirs is a little higher. Odds are you're still going to be okay. Making sure that we get the right treatment. I was reading a study out of Texas talking about how they were looking at snake bite cases. And for those with copperheads, water moccasins, they usually didn't even have to give anti-venom to those cases. So again, it's not going to be as severe. Now, water moccasins, and also known as cottonmouths, are called cottonmouths because whenever they are threatened, they're going to gape at you. They're going to open their mouth. It's very pale, very white, kind of looks, again, kind of like that cotton type of thing. And that's what they're going to do as part of a kind of defense posture. Often are confused with relatively harmless water snakes. So just because you see a snake in the water does not make it a water moccasin. Okay. So kind of, they're usually all darker banded. Water moccasins are going to be heavier bodied also. And so just kind of looking for some of those things. Another trick is whenever you're looking at them swimming and they're undisturbed, I believe it's the water moccasins, their full body is going to be under the water. Other water snakes too might hang out kind of in trees or other things. Water moccasins you might see kind of more on rocks or on the ground. And one important note also that I noticed in helping to kind of identify the two at quick glance, usually if you come up upon a snake and you see him sitting there, regular water snakes, odds are just going to flee pretty quickly. Water moccasins might try to stand their ground a little bit, and that's when they're going to show you that threat display, that gaping of their mouth at you. And you're like, oh, that's who you are. All right. And so again, with them, despite kind of claims that people have, researched those that they're really not highly aggressive species and really only bite again when they're kind of messed with or stepped on an accident or picked up. And so again, just kind of following along those same lines of copperheads, just making sure we watch where we're going. And when the snake, odds are so even with rattlesnakes and other things, they don't want to mess with you. They're not trying to go for you. They're not gunning for you. We have nothing to offer them. We're not food. We're not anything like that for them. We're just a potential predator. So they will only do that if they feel like they need to protect themselves. And usually as long as we're watching where we're going and just kind of being mindful about that, they're gonna, if they have to, they're gonna try to tell you to back off. In the case of water moccasins, again, doing that threat display. In the case of rattlesnakes, using their rattle to signal to you that they don't want you around. Like they're trying to tell you that it's not cool. We just have to remember to listen to that and kind of give them their space that way. But again, their venom potency is not as high as you would see with rattlesnakes as well. So odds are you would still be okay. But again, both of these snakes are not highly aggressive, despite stories that people might say or you might hear. The research shows that they're really not that aggressive, and they're just going to do it if they feel like they have to defend themselves.
Okay. So that covers the two snakes really are the ones that I wanted to make sure people learned about, because these are the two that people, I think, when they're out in the woods here in Alabama, they freak out the most. Like, oh, I'm going to get bitten by something. I shouldn't spend time outside. Yes, you should, but you probably won't get bitten by something.
I have worked and hiked and done all of these things again for 7 years. And I work directly with snakes almost every day, teaching with them, and I have not been bit. So if you are, the best you can do is be smart on your end. And as long as you're kind of able to do that on your end and try your best, you'll be okay. You'll be all right. I know it's hard. A lot of our common programming, I notice, and it is a common frustration for me when you often see programming that they really want to play up the venom toxicity and the potency, and they really want to make it sound this one's this venomous or this one's this venomous. And usually even when you see wildlife programming, whether it's, people on YouTube or wherever else, they might be instigating threat displays from wildlife to get cool video. And they're like, oh, it's super aggressive. And I'm like, that's because you poked at it for half an hour. He's not happy about it. Like, that's why he looks like that. He's not cool if it just happened. And so you're able to see these things. And so then people think that that's automatically what happens. And the case is that it's not. And we even have some snakes, hognose snakes, which you might as well find also. They're really cute. They have these little upturned noses that they use to root around in sandy soils. You have, Western and Eastern ones. And when they are startled and scared, they literally play dead. They feign death. It's highly dramatic. I recommend everybody looks up a video of it. I think it's fantastic. I'm talking, they roll over, their mouth gapes open, they drool an obscene amount. And during this display, if you try to flip them back over, they do the whole dramatic death roll back over again. These animals just want to survive. They don't want anything really to do with us. And so when you're seeing things in videos that show, highly aggressive this, this is in the United States. Now, if you're in Australia, that might be a different story. They have whole other rules over there, but for the case of North America, the majority of what we're finding here wants nothing to do with us. And if you're seeing videos that are saying otherwise, that they're highly aggressive, highly this, highly that, I would have some questions about what happened before that video was taken. Are you, messing with them to get them to do this display to you? Are you doing these things with them? Because in my experience, as long as you're pretty calm and minding your own business, they're very happy to mind their own as well.
All right, so let's move on to the next one. This one is one everybody who works in the woods in Alabama needs to be aware of. I realized that I probably picked the cutest, cuddliest picture of this animal.
You did.
Yeah, I was like, okay, I need to find one that's at least like semi-threatening, but I couldn't. So this is the one Wikipedia gave me.
That's fine. He's very fluffy. He's very cute looking. So wild boar are they're really tricky. Right now, they are a issue with wildlife management because they do cause a lot of damage. One important thing to note is that boar and swine are not really native to the Western world. I think that they came from Asia. So they're not even native to this area. So when we have some of our pigs and feral pigs that start breeding and kind of creating these wild boar populations that have expanded over, more recent history, they just kind of take over. And you have to remember, pigs are very smart creatures. So in the case of wild boar, you're thinking this is a smart animal, often with tusks and a aggressive nature. So these are ones that I personally would steer clear of if I saw them as best as I could, because they are going to go for you. They are going to defend themselves. They do cause a lot of ecological damage, and they're not even, native species here that fit in with kind of our ecological roles. They also don't really have a variety of predators, of natural predators. So they tend to just do, I believe, like millions of dollars of damage every year. And one of their worst kind of damaging amounts is going to be rooting as they go through, but they do have like complex kind of social dynamic, and they are cool in their own way. When you like close your eyes about the ecological damage part, they are cool when they like communicate, in their communication, their social structure, and that they are extremely smart. But I will suggest that when you see a boar, you get some space. Just,
yeah, I recommend, if you see one, avoid it at whatever cost you can take. Yep. Just leave the area like immediately.
Yeah, they're one of the ones that usually when we talk, when talking about wildlife, and like, oh, even with bears or this or this or this, talking about, great management techniques and ways that you can reduce like your interactions and things like that. And then we're like, wild boar. And you're like, yeah, no, just
leave, go.
Just don't do that one. Just don't mess with boar. Yeah, just leave them alone. They're their own thing. I have worked a lot with prior to switching and focusing primarily with native wildlife. Whenever I was younger, I thought the only way I would get to work with animals was if I was a veterinarian. And so I actually started out doing some veterinary work, and that started out working with a lot of livestock versus small animals. So I used to work a lot with cattle and pigs as well. And I can tell you, even with just domesticated pigs, they're very clever. They like to bite a lot. They're very like oratory kind of feelers. And so when you have that experience with them, when they're comfortable with people, I can imagining the interaction with boar. I've not personally I've managed to avoid these interactions with wild boar, but and they're kind of expanding and going through as they can. So that again poses a really interesting management difficulty there. But working with swine in a domesticated area and understanding their behavior that way and how clever they are and how smart they are. And when they're just trying to trick you out, they're, feeling up. I remember they were feeling up like on my calf and like biting on my calf and all these other things on my legs when I was standing next to them. So you can only imagine a much more extreme case after working with them in a nicer setting and how they can be there. That's why, my experience is like, no, just go the other way. Just don't.
Yeah, this is one I haven't personally seen either, but I've gotten, enough horror stories about this one to know to leave the other way or carry a large caliber weapon when I go in the field. And
Yeah.
I don't really condone carrying a weapon with you in the field, but if you have to have one, it's best to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it.
Yeah, so this is one that I would be, and I am not an expert when it comes to boar. I definitely teach more with a lot of our reptiles and birds and things like that and other mammals. But with wild boar, yeah, they depend. I obviously never really want to say, taking them out there and taking matters in your hands, depending on the manager style. But looking at one thing I would always recommend is also checking out in your area or wherever you're planning to go. If you have a site planned, see if your local Fish and Wildlife, your local management has said anything, because they should be pretty on top of, or hopefully pretty invested in managing boar populations. And so you should be able to find kind of updates on what's happening through your Fish and Wildlife and things like that, since they are a pretty seriously damaging species that requires management. So you should be able to find information that way, whether it's where you are currently or if there's a site that you have planned. You can always kind of check out what that situation is, because this is really one of the very few that I would really be concerned about versus any of the other ones, just for safety.
And I really wish I had taken the time to find a more threatening picture of this animal, because it's really hard to take it seriously with how big and fluffy it looks.
You're like, no, I promise. They can be really aggressive.
Please, please avoid them. Don't let this picture mislead you. They are not cute and fluffy like this one.
No, it's like with bears, very adorable faces, but they're another one that you want to do it from a distance. Appreciate them from a great distance. Yeah.
Speaking of cute and fluffy, let's talk about the bobcat.
I love bobcats. They're so cool. But I will say you're going to have very, very few interactions with bobcats, as they're nocturnal and pretty secretive. So honestly, I wouldn't be super concerned as you're going out in any sites or anything like that. They're not really going to mess with you. Again, you have to remember, this is a predator. They're really fun because they got big feet. Which is fun whenever you get to see them, but they are nocturnal. They're pretty secretive. They're going to be preying, on other birds, smaller things like that. But that's why you're very rarely you're going to be seeing them. And unless you have really concerns, usually the only time we discuss bobcats with management style or people being concerned about them are when they're concerned about like chickens or something else like that. But I'm assuming you're not taking chickens out with you on an archaeological site or having anything.
I mean, if we get hungry, we might, but
yeah, but you're not building a coop or anything out there with you to attract them. So odds are, these guys are probably going to watch you from a distance if they're around. But even with this, like, we're excited when we get to see them. Unfortunately, every time I've had to see them or seen them in person, it was when they were killed by a vehicle strike. So I've only ever seen them in person when they were already dead. So it's twice that I've seen them after being hit by a vehicle. And then once I interacted with a bobcat, and that was during a wildlife necropsy where we were doing necropsies on a variety of predators from a quail plantation. So it was an area that was being managed strictly for quail. And so they were moving some of these predators. A bobcat was one of them. And you just don't really see them as much. You see evidence of them, but you just
they leave very distinct, like, large footprints when you see them. Like, they've been there, but you don't actually see them because they're very quiet when they move.
Yeah. they're doing their thing. They're really
They have these
secret.
big, giant, like cat feet.
Yeah, they're cool. They're really cool. Their tracks are really cool. Another thing that would also be beneficial whenever you talk about kind of identification, you can always take time to learn a little bit of what different animal tracks might look like. Because one, it's fun. It's just fun to be able to do. You can see kind of what wildlife has been there and what hasn't. And two, that is going to help you if you're at a site and you're seeing some of these tracks around. That might kind of give you some information about what was going on there, who's passing through. But bobcat tracks are really cool. Especially, you're not seeing, their claw, they have like retractable claws, so you're not going to be seeing those marks like you would see with, with coyotes or other tracks like that. But theirs are really cool. Mountain lion tracks are really cool. And that's something that I have much more experience with now since moving, to California, as we monitor a lot more for mountain lions and things like that here. But I like bobcats. Again, there's something that if you did interact with them, keep your distance because they can absolutely defend themselves if necessary. But no, odds are they're gonna avoid you. They're not interested in you very much. They're more interested in eating a quail or something like that.
So the reason I picked this one is a friend of mine was working on a project in South Carolina, and they had actually noticed the bobcat, like watching them work during the day. Like it would hide like in a distant tree line or something, but it was more curious about what they were doing than threatened by what they were doing.
Just watching you.
Yeah.
Who are you? What are you doing? But again, didn't really interact. Just watching. But that's a really cool thing. If you had a bobcat watching you, that'd be kind of cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. But no, they're not gonna. I'm never really concerned about that either. Larger carnivores and things like that, yes. But in the case of the bobcat, I'm not super concerned.
All right, so this next one is one I think everybody really should know. If you haven't seen one before, you've probably heard it. It makes a very distinct, like yipping kind of sound, or you might have seen it chasing a cartoon roadrunner at some point in your life. So,
yes. So coyotes are. I like coyotes. This is not a shared sentiment of, among a lot of people. Whenever I was helping manage this forest, we had trail cams throughout the property, and it was 65 acres. We had a family of coyotes who lived there, and, these pups. And so I actually got to kind of watch them grow up on these trail cams as they come up and be super curious about the camera. And so they're really interesting canines. They're really curious, not necessarily always aggressive, but that curiosity can kind of confuse people, right? You're like, why is this creature walking up to me? He's trying to check you out, trying to figure out what's going on. They do have an extremely important ecological role. So coyotes, they like to eat smaller mammals, so mesocarnivores. So we're thinking skunks, raccoons, things like that. Those are going to be smaller carnivores that are going to be interested in eating songbirds or taking their eggs. So by having coyotes who consume those smaller predators like raccoons, and the raccoons are eating, eggs, birds, other things, having a greater presence of coyotes is being linked to improved or increased songbird populations because they're able to help provide this balance. So coyotes have a really important kind of key role in helping kind of maintain systems in a forest. So they're really important that way, but they're also highly adaptable. They do a really good job adapting, living very close to people. So they often get considered more of an urban animal, like you might also consider with raccoons. And so with them, it does get tricky because they are curious. They can adapt really well. They're very smart. And they are kind of loud, and it might be kind of startling to hear. But with them, usually if you startle them, they're going to leave. But if you do see them and they might come try to check you out and try to figure out what you're doing. But that's just because they are just a more curious species that way. They just want to figure out what's going on. They're trying to figure out why you're here. Even with the museum that I work with now, we have a resident coyote, and I believe she had 2 pups. And they routinely will come up every once in a while and try to check out the front. They come almost up to the door trying to figure out what's going on. And trying to kind of figure things out. And so we usually just kind of have to startle them and make them realize like this is not necessarily an area that's safe for them. And that usually involves being really loud and things like that, kind of startle them that way. But they will kind of figure you out. And sometimes when we think about their behavior, understanding their behavior is going to be kind of important. There is one thing that they do, it's called escorting. Which is my understanding from other researchers who've done this. And so with that kind of coyote escorting, where you might be leaving an area, right? And you notice that coyote's following you. And you're like, why is that coyote following me? He's trying to make sure you leave. He's trying to make sure that you are on your way out of his area. So they might escort you out, basically, making sure that you're actually leaving. Because you have to remember, these are animals that do have their own area. They do want to make sure that they're surviving. They might be curious of why you're there. They might follow you around a little bit, be really curious. Again, it's one of those things that you do not, they're, in my opinion, I think that they're very cute animals. They are not your house pets. Don't touch them. Don't just don't pet them.
Don't touch the animals. I don't know how many times, I have to go to a historic site, a national park, and there's a big giant sign that says do not touch the animals.
No, don't touch them, and especially when you're thinking about coyotes, right? If they do have that really curious behavior and he's coming up to check you out, that does not mean he's walking up to you the same way your dog at your house does. It's not the same. He's trying to figure out what you're doing. So don't put your hand out and try to touch him. That could be pretty bad. But they are really cool animals that have really curious behaviors. And they're definitely, if you're someone who's interested more in understanding all of those individual behaviors that way, since I know we have to talk about so many animals, we'll just kind of touch on them a little bit, but they're definitely something worth looking into. And they are often, they get a bad rap. Saying, oh, it's a coyote or it's this or it's this. But they do have important ecological roles, especially after the removal of larger wolves and things like that. They have kind of tried to fill in some of those gaps. And so they are important, like I said, with research talking about having coyotes and those populations of them being able to help boost songbird populations by helping provide that extra balance, right? So they are important. Their behaviors are cool. And when you're able to kind of learn a little bit more about them and understand that some of their behavior isn't necessarily a threat as much as it is being curious, because that's what they are. Hopefully that'll also kind of mitigate some of those fears and help you feel a little bit more confident whenever you go out, and realize that usually if you're loud, you'll be all right.
So one last thing on coyotes, you mentioned wolves. Are these a pack animal also, or are they more solitary?
I believe they are not the way that wolves are. I believe that they tend to be more solitary or more kind of paired. I believe it's more paired. Let me triple check. I have all of my information here. I always have all of my information in front of me in case there's something that I cannot quite remember off the top of my head. When we talk about our coyotes, my experience with them is like whenever they were being raised, that they did kind of stick together for a while. They are social. They're super social. And I'm trying to figure out, they will actually kind of form larger groups. That's not true. Yes, I was incorrect. So they do form their larger groups that way. But usually you think about wolves as kind of being those pack animals, but they will kind of form these larger family groups. That's when you're hearing a lot of I was getting them confused with foxes. So that's when you're hearing a lot of those yipping, a lot of that communication. They're communicating with each other. They're really social with each other. They might be in larger groups. You might see them smaller in different pairs or smaller groups. But they're really cool. They're social. They're very social animals that way. One of my favorite experiences with them, I say, was again managing this forest when we knew we had a population and we knew we had pups. We'd seen the pups. And I would routinely go down and collect casts of their tracks pretty routinely to try to figure out where they were. We also had a population of deer that came through. We had a herd that came through, and we had a lot of raccoons, skunks, opossums. We had a very healthy kind of ecosystem going on, which is really cool. middle of the day in Atlanta Georgia, and we hear fire trucks go by. So fire trucks, and then all of a sudden you hear all of these yipping coming from farther into the forest. And it was all the coyotes reacting that way and yipping along with sirens. So normally you might hear that kind of more during the nighttime, but they will also do that with sirens, same way some of our pets and dogs might do that. And so that was kind of fun hearing them and knowing, you know, I had a expectation from where I found their tracks of where their den might be and like that kind of location that way. And it was right from that area. You hear all this yipping come back out right when the sirens went past. And we had some visitors at the time. We're like, oh, are those dogs? And I was like, no, they're not. They're coyotes. And that was fun. I remember that. That was a really fun kind of experience with them that way. But I have a soft spot for coyotes that way. Just remember that they are curious, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's intended to be aggressive. So kind of understanding some of that behavior a little bit more can change how we kind of interact and kind of tolerate those interactions that way.
So on to this next one. You know, everyone has probably seen this one and know what it is. It's an armadillo. You've probably seen it, you know, on the side of the road. You know, it kind of does this weird like stroll thing through the forest. Like it's not, you know, necessarily running away, but it's also not like taking its time either.
Yeah, I really like armadillos. I have a soft spot for them. We obviously hear all the time that armadillos will make you really sick because they are one of the other animals that can kind of contract and give leprosy. But it's my understanding that it's actually really rare for that to happen.
Yeah, it's I actually heard that not too long ago. The study I saw said it's 1 in 5.
Yeah, did they say 1 in 5?
Yeah.
It's not super rare, in my opinion. Yeah, so that I'm not sure. The one that I saw did not quote a number, but saying that it was, you know, that's like 20%. 20% is kind of, I don't know, it depends on your definition of rare. That's not bad. That's not nearly from what you usually hear. What you would guess would be like people would thinking, oh, it's 4 out of 5. You know, chance that you're going to contract something from them, but 1 out of 5 is not bad. But depending on how much you're interacting with them, again, because certain species like armadillos, raccoons, some animals kind of like that, you do want to be mindful of zoonotic diseases and things like that, kind of keeping your space that way. In the case with armadillos, you know, because you can contract leprosy, even though it's not super duper common, that kind of 20% chance that way, it's still a chance, you know. But again, just don't touch the animals. Overall, the one thing that you can gain from this whole conversation is just don't touch them. Just don't touch the wildlife that way, and you're going to be all right. Armadillos are pretty cool. I like them. I think that they're funny. My interactions with them have always been really dorky interactions. Whatever they do, I never can take them seriously. We were once in a forest. It was a research forest in North Georgia. And we were walking through, and this little armadillo is just, you know, doing his little strut. Again, not like taking it, kind of taking his time, but like not necessarily running. And I guess he didn't realize that we were behind him until one of us stepped either on a branch or something like that made a lot of sound. And he turned around, noticed us, jumped straight up in the air, and then like hauled all the way down a hill because we were very close. So every interaction I've had with them has never been threatening. They're more, your argument for them can be that they're more inconvenient, especially from what you said with your interactions with them, archaeologically speaking, that they do dig, they do burrow. And that can definitely have some issues if you're an archaeologist having that damage kind of that way with them there. They've been expanding their range for quite a while. And that's probably going to continue, especially as we have up from the Southeast down into Texas and things like that. And so they're just continuing to kind of expand. And depending on the population that you have there, they're most likely being managed by, you know, state fish and wildlife, state wildlife services, things like that are usually going to be managing those populations, especially as their range expands. And they're kind of entering into other areas. They're armor there is going to be really protective for them. That's going to help kind of protect them against predators. They're usually really vulnerable whenever they're young, and that kind of shell on the outside isn't as hard as it normally is. Not all armadillos can curl up into the super cool ball. Sometimes it's only kind of partial. That way they can kind of protect themselves. Unfortunately, I don't think I have any advice for having them not dig up your stuff. I don't know how to kind of help with that one.
I've asked that question of several people, various park rangers, people who have worked in
Yeah.
natural history museums, and they say it's really just something you have to live with. It's, since it's burrowing, it's not like
Yeah.
you can just go back and fill in the hole that the animal dug out.
Yeah, I can't think of anything. It's just one of those things. It's kind of a bummer. You're like, man, like the armadillo's here. Yeah, I don't really think there's much you can do. They're just gonna potentially do it again, unfortunately. But yeah, they're also, again, they're another one of the things that if you are concerned, about, again, zoonotic disease interaction, again, the chain of thought here is just don't touch them. I'm gonna give them their space that way. Don't pick them up, don't play with them. Don't really harass them very much. Don't stress them out that way. And that is one thing also that we can talk about with a lot of wildlife, especially depending on the species, like when we talk about like deer or rabbits and things like that. Sometimes those interactions with humans can be extremely stressful and cause a reaction called capture myopathy. And that's usually what you'll see. Capture myopathy basically is whenever an animal gets so stressed out, it ultimately affects their muscles and leads to death. And the reason it's called capture myopathy is because if you think about when an animal is captured, or when an animal is taken in for research, or like taking samples or anything like that, you have to take a lot of extra care and making sure that they're able to recover and keeping situations as calm with the least amount of stress as possible for that animal to increase their chance of survival afterwards. But it's kind of a misnomer in that the animal does not need to actually be physically captured in order to suffer. If you harass an animal enough, that stress can be so much that they will still die. Like rabbits, for example, you can like harass them and stress them out so much that they're still going to have that same reaction, even if you never touched them. So in general, when it comes to wildlife, you probably hear this all the time, whether it's from, park rangers, other educators, nature center, wildlife rehabilitators, give them space. Just let them have their space, give them their time. That's going to reduce your impact with them, their impact on you the majority of the time. If you kind of just mind your own business, odds are you're going to be okay. And it's going to increase their chance of survival and making sure that they're okay versus having some kind of terrible reaction or something like that to your presence.
Yeah, the funniest thing I've ever seen about an armadillo is I've walked past, one or two in the field, and it was obvious that this animal was indifferent to me being there. He's like, you know what, I'm going to do my thing, do whatever it is you're doing. I'm going to go this way, you're going to go wherever. I don't really care what you're doing. I'm like,
Yeah.
all right, that's not really what I expected, but okay.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, with them, they make me laugh. Just watching them move around makes me kind of laugh. And
It's kind of like a turtle kind of movement, but it's not a turtle.
It's like a waddle almost.
Yeah.
Like a little, I don't know. They're funny. I like them. And again, that one interaction I had was because we started it on accident. I don't think he even realized that we were there until he heard whatever had happened, whatever branch broke or something like that. And he was like, oh God. And he like jumped up really high and kind of freaked out a little bit.
Well, looking at this picture of him, I wonder if he can actually look and see what's behind him.
No, it wasn't until like he was in front of us. We were coming up behind and he's just like doing his thing. And we were like, oh, look, he's like right there. Da, 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 da. And then, branch broke or something that was a little bit louder. And he's like, he's like, I didn't know you were there. And kind of freaked out. But that's my favorite kind of interaction with them. Just a very interesting kind of reaction. Very, very explosive. You just like, oh God, I didn't realize you were there. And then just kind of was like, I'm going to go this way. And then he went down the hill. But usually they're just like, I don't want to.
Yeah, they express obvious indifference to what you do.
Yeah, which is nice.
Yeah. All right, so everybody should know what this one is. And again, I apologize for picking the cutest pictures of these animals.
You should pick the cutest ones. I am a huge opossum fan. Massive. This is a great choice in photo. So with opossums, I love them dearly. They are one of my favorite things to talk about, one of my favorite things to do interpretations with and of. I had the wonderful honor of getting to work with 2 opossum wildlife ambassadors before. Fantastic. They're so great. They are North America's only native, or the United States' only native marsupial. So we say marsupial, again, thinking along the same lines, kangaroos, right? That they're going to keep their young in their pouch. So when little baby possums are born, they're about the size of a jelly bean. They're going to finish kind of developing in that pouch there. And then they come out and they cling onto their mother's back and just hang on. Obscenely cute creatures, in my opinion. People think that they're large rats, but they are not. They're not rodents at all. They're their own thing. Like I said, they are going to be our marsupials here. I'm trying to think about where to start with this because they get such a bad rap for no reason, and it makes me mad. And so first with possums, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the first one, that they play dead is usually what you hear them with. Possums, especially now through like memes and other things like that, are always like big symbols of like anxiety and like just super stressed out.
Just about to say that.
Yeah. So they just,
it's a Facebook page I follow. It's actually called The Anxious Possum, and it's like
I
a
follow
possum.
that one too. I love it.
It's like a screaming possum saying, "I decided to quit my job and now I scream."
Yeah. No, I love them, but it's because of this kind of behavior that when they are seriously threatened, they do go into a kind of forced catatonic state where they're playing dead. It's very convincing. It is not the same as what I mentioned earlier with hognose snakes that do just a display. They can come in and out of it pretty quickly, those snakes can. Opossums, my understanding is they don't come in and out of it as fast as you would think. And it takes a lot of energy, and it's their way to kind of try to protect themselves with the idea of like when they're really startled, like if a coyote is trying to come get them, they play dead. I'm talking the smell is really bad. Like it's convincing. With the idea that like, okay, if I look really gross and I seem dead, maybe this animal's not going to want to eat me. Or maybe if you're a human, you're going to think, oh, this animal's dead. Like I'll just leave it alone. And then you come back and you realize that the possum's gone because he's come back out of that catatonic state. He's able to leave. Right. So they do go into that state that unfortunately is like the only thing that they're known for. And I'm on a very like personal mission to change that kind of narrative with them. I love them so much. So they do that as well, but we're going to talk about a lot of the really cool things about them. So usually when you think of mammals like this, right, one of your things you're going to talk about when we're thinking about diseases. All right. So usually you might be worried about things like rabies. Opossums, again, are marsupials, right? When we talk about rabies with opossums, they are extremely resistant to rabies. Odds are it's not going to happen. There are like a couple cases where they have been able to successfully contract rabies, but it's extremely rare. So odds are you are never going to get rabies from a possum because of their internal temperature. They're just not a good host for the virus. And so it's just not really going to happen. They're not considered rabies vectors, really, because of that resistance. Sometimes people say it's an immunity, but it's not really an immunity. They have that really great resistance for that. They're really poor hosts for the rabies virus. So you don't have to be worried about that. So not only are they not going to be pushing around rabies like other animals like raccoons might be, right, or other mammals that way, they also are linked to helping reduce the spread of diseases. And now this is where you might be concerned, especially if you're going out of the field a lot, when we think about ticks, right? Ticks are going to be the ones I'd be concerned about if you're depending on the season that you're going out. These nasty little arachnids, which ticks are arachnids, they're not insects. So these arachnids here have the thing that you usually are worried about are going to be like Lyme disease. Yeah. Right. And that can be a pretty debilitating kind of chronic illness. I have a friend who unfortunately contracted. I know a handful of people that's actually have unfortunately contracted Lyme disease. Opossums love, love, love to keep themselves clean. They love to groom themselves, right? So when ticks hop onto an opossum, opossums are constantly grooming, constantly keeping themselves clean, almost like a cat. They're consuming and they're eating all of these ticks. They're known to eat like thousands of ticks in a season, right? So by having these opossums, they are eating all these ticks. They're actually going to try to help reduce that spread of the disease. Less ticks, less chance to bite you, less Lyme disease spread, right? So they're really important in that and helping kind of reduce those zoonotic diseases that way and kind of passing those along. And so they're really cool. They're not going to give you rabies. They're probably trying to help protect you from Lyme disease and icky other things like ticks. And with them just in general, not only are they kind of doing it more directly that way, but they are like nature's fuzzy vacuum cleaners. I love them. They're great. They're eating all this carrion. They're eating all these different types of things. They love to eat other things like roaches, right? They'll eat those. They're eating a variety of stuff. They're just cleaning all this stuff up, helping keep kind of our forests and things clean. And just doing a great job and helping kind of reduce the spread of diseases in that process. And another really fun thing about them is when we think, if you can see in the picture, these little hands, they're my
He
favorite.
does have like little fingers. I noticed that when I picked that one earlier. I was
They
like,
do. So in the front, you see these, they look like, when you look at, I love opossum tracks and I love raccoon tracks. They look like little hands. But what's really cool about opossums, you have their front hands. They also have their back feet. They have opposable thumbs on their back feet, like we do. So their thumbs do this as well. They also have a prehensile tail. Now, usually you'll see in cute little calendars, a baby opossum that's hanging by its tail. They never hang from their tails like that. That usually only happens if they lost their balance, right? So that tail there can actually help kind of with keeping their balance, helping them grip onto things if they're worried they're going to fall. So that's really cool. Like I said, I've been able to have the opportunity to have them with ambassador animals and working with them. And oftentimes I would have an opossum tail, wrap around my hand. And it's actually it's pretty good grip to kind of help them stay balanced there. I got these little nails. They do just look like little hands. And they have these really sweet little black ears. And then their faces, they're so fun because they actually have some of the most teeth of any mammal. I believe they have about 50 teeth and they're all sharp. And I can say I've never been bitten by a snake, but I have been bitten by a possum. I was working with a possum once who, whenever you started to handle him, he wanted you to know that this was an agreement between the two of you. And he would sometimes just barely kind of bite on your arm if something was going on, or, if it was too loud or something like that. And so I can tell you from experience that those teeth feel like puppy teeth. When the milk teeth, when they're very needle-like, it's like that, right? So with them, they have a lot of these teeth. And usually this is what leads to all the memes, right? The picture with them standing there with their mouths open. What that is kind of an attempted threat display. I say threat display. It's not really
that hisses like a cat does.
Yeah, so they're gonna hiss and it freaks people out. It's doing its job, right? Are they gonna gun for you and try to bite you and try to come after you? No. But if they are concerned for themselves, they will show those teeth. All of those, that very toothy kind of grin with those 50 very like milk-like kind of puppy teeth, and what they feel like they are very sharp. They're going to flash you those teeth and they are going to hiss, and that's trying to tell you just to kind of back off and leave them alone. And it's those pictures of that reaction that's like super common and all the anxiety induced possum memes that exist, right?
Yeah.
But usually they're just chilling out and they look like this picture. And I think that they are adorable. They're one of my favorite ones. They're the reason, in addition to doing like all of my wildlife education, I also have my own kind of art project that creates pieces all about native wildlife. And it's literally called The Overlooked Opossum because they're one of my favorite ones to start with. And it's for these reasons. They have so many cool things about them that just go underappreciated and we don't even realize. Like I can talk about possums all day. And so another thing with them is usually whenever you think like growing up as kids, we always hear the story of, the cobra and the mongoose, right? That can like go against each other and the mongoose can get the cobra, the whole thing. Opossums are immune to pit viper venom. So you remember when we were talking about copperheads and we're talking about water moccasins, opossums are immune to that and they eat them. They can eat them. If they bite them, it doesn't matter. They don't care. They're fine. So we talk, on the other side of the world, we're like, oh, there's all these cool creatures, these cool mammals, that are immune to this venom. Like we have possums here. They eat rattlesnakes. They're cool, they're all these really cool things. And so opossums are one of my favorites, my favorite animals, arguably my top favorite animal. And so I want them to be known for more than just their anxiety, as cute and as funny as the memes are in my mind. I also still love them. They are more than just the anxiety and the stress, right? They have all these cool things about them. They work so hard in maintaining like our ecology and keeping a lot of our forests clean, helping reduce risks of disease and spread to humans. And one thing also that you can do for possums today is, especially in the wintertime, because they have these sweet little exposed fingertips, right? In their tail, it does not have fur. They have their little ears that are exposed that way also. Around the wintertime, if you notice opossums trying to kind of hang out and set up in a warm spot by your house, maybe just let them stay. They're not really going to do anything to you, but in wintertime, they are more of a risk for frostbite and things like that that can damage them because those are, exposed sections of them. So it gets to wintertime, it's starting to get kind of cold. Just let them hang out. They're not going to cause issues. If anything, they're going to clean up your house, probably clean up all the stuff that's outside, eat a bunch of that stuff for you. And just let them do their thing. That way they can protect themselves a little bit more from some of the elements. As long, now if they're like in your house, maybe not let them stay in there. But if they're hanging out behind your garage or something like that, maybe just let them kind of hang out that way and do that, because I promise you, they're gonna be your best friend once you realize all the good that they're gonna do for you in your environment, kind of that way and around you, especially getting rid of the things that you would probably rather not have. Like most people were worried about, even though I love snakes also, if most people are concerned about venomous snakes, if you have a possum around, they're gonna try to take care of that problem a little bit for you, right? So huge opossum advocate. Also, there's a difference. Usually people hear opossum and possum. They're different animals. Opossums are here in the Americas. Possums are in Australia. They're different species. They're both marsupials, but they are different. Now, when we're talking about it here, usually in the United States, we drop the O sometimes. It's more of a colloquialism, just saying possum. We know what we're talking about. If anybody gives you an obscenely hard time about that, they probably need to calm down. Like, I love them, and I'm not going to get onto anybody for saying opossum versus possum. But there is a difference between, they are different animals, and that can sometimes lead to miscommunication between what species you're talking about, especially if we're talking with somebody in Australia. Actually, if they say, oh, I saw a possum, and you're like, oh, I saw a possum, you're talking about two different animals that do different things. So there is a difference that way. Yeah, sorry. See, I can talk about opossums for an extreme length of time. They're one of my favorite ones.
One thing about the opossum is it kind of moves like the armadillo does. It's kind of like not exactly a waddle, but it's kind of, on the sluggish side too.
Yeah, they're not like crazy predators. Like they're not, you watch them move and you're like, all right, they're just doing their thing that way. Again, they don't really want to interact with you as much. One thing that you might see, they are usually going to be nocturnal, or maybe a little bit more crepuscular, maybe seeing them in the early mornings and kind of in the late evenings. They're going to come out more at night. Now, if you have a mama possum, she might be awake more during the day because she might have to forage more to feed all of her babies. And so sometimes at night, you might see one mama possum, you're going to see that set of eyes. And again, like I said, all the babies are going to cling onto her back. And so you might see all those other little sets of eyes there with her. But
you've all probably seen this one in a meme also. It's about, carrying the weight of your family or something on your back.
There's so many. I have so many of them on my phone. I have a lot. I have a lot of opossum content that exists there, but they're great. And they're one of my favorite ones. my favorite animals. I'm really happy you picked this picture. This is what they look like the majority of the time.
When they're not being memed, this is what they look like.
Yeah, but the memes are funny, and that's why it's taken off. And I think they're funny too, but we also have to share this side, the cool side of them. They're more than just anxiety riddled machines that I relate to far too frequently. They're also,
we all do. All right,
they're
so
very
that brings us to this last one. Everyone should know what this one is. It's cute, adorable, has a burglar-like appearance, and most people now refer to it as a trash panda rather than the actual name for it.
So you probably know this. Huntsville, Alabama has a baseball team.
Yes.
Called the Trash Pandas, and it is a raccoon in a trash can rocket ship.
Yes.
And it's my favorite team mascot I think I've ever seen. So that's what they're called.
Yeah, I got my sister one of their shirts for Christmas or her birthday last year, and it had that logo on it, and it said 2020 just trash.
Okay,
and I thought that was the funniest thing I've ever seen.
I've not seen that one. Okay, I need to go back and look. I have family that lives in Huntsville, and so if you ever fly into the airport, there's like the big mural of like the trash pandas, and nobody believes me that it's real, but it is. They think it's made up, and I'm like, no, this is their mascot.
No, you drive past it every time you're leaving Huntsville. It's big, blue, and says trash pandas on it.
It's beautiful. It's the greatest mascot I've ever seen in my entire life. So it's just great. And so I cannot talk about raccoons and the trash pandas without mentioning this beautiful thing that exists out there. So yeah, we got that out of the way. So with raccoons, they are adorable. I will say they are another animal that is considered an urban animal. However, they get a lot of love in a way I feel like the opossum should get a lot of love, when in reality, raccoons can actually be really aggressive. And they are known as rabies vectors. So usually, for example, right now, we also have a raccoon that we work with, but if you work with that animal, you have to get special rabies boosters as a human when you work with rabies vectors that way. And so you have to have some of those extra kind of vaccinations and things like that to make sure that you're able to stay healthy in case something were to ever happen. When you work more, with rabies vectors animals, you get the boosters, things like that. But raccoons, I have mixed feelings about raccoons sometimes. I really like them. I love their tracks. I love a lot of what they do. They're really funny. They're very clever kind of animals. When they're going around like in a troop with each other, their social game is really great. But they can cause a lot of issues with people. They are adaptable, super adaptable, and they can kind of cause some issues with people that way. And another thing that I run into a lot, which is one of the reasons that where I work right now, we do, like I said, we do have a raccoon who's considered a non-releasable animal. And oftentimes the reason that we get non-releasable wildlife is either, in his case, it was due to injury, but sometimes you get them because somebody thought this animal was so cute that they wanted to take them home and make them a pet. And then once you do that and they live under human care for so long, they lose their natural fear of humans. And
they lose their natural survival instincts because you feed them cat food.
Yep. And that causes a lot of problems. So whenever you go to the park and you see it say, don't feed the animals, and then you notice all of these raccoons coming out of the bush at you with their hands out, they think you have food for them. They're relating humans to a food source. And when that happens, sometimes those animals have to be removed because it increases the chance of disease transmission from animal to human. Especially when we're talking about species like raccoons, it increases the chance for really negative interactions and bites and attacks, because you can absolutely have that with raccoons. They have no problem defending themselves that way. Like how I mentioned with opossums who might show their teeth at you and just really hope that you fall for it and like don't mess with them. Raccoons, they will tell you to back off and they will make you back off if they feel like they have to. And so those have been some kind of interactions with them. They're another one of the animals that I think are really cute, but you should kind of respect from a distance. Please, 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 please do not leave food out for your neighborhood raccoons. I promise you, they are just fine. They can do it themselves. Usually when people do that or leave out cat food for them or leave out these things for them, it is again kind of taking away that natural fear that's extremely important for them and their survival and can lead to a lot more conflict. Just let them do their thing. Remember that these are wild animals. Even if we think they're adorable, they're great. You know, put all that love into like trash panda merchandise. If you really want to hug something, like do that. Get a stuffed raccoon, but don't mess with the actual real one, because that leads to a lot of wildlife conflict that ultimately can result in that animal's removal and death if necessary, right? And so the better we are on our end about making sure we're being respectful of those rules and of those boundaries with these animals, the better relationship we can have with them, right? So that's just one important thing with raccoons that way. But they are cool. They are one of those kind of mesocarnivores that we talked about. They are omnivores. They are known for being little pillagers, going in, taking eggs, taking birds' nests, getting into your trash cans, obviously. Really just being able to scavenge, do all these things really, really well.
These are highly adaptable animals. And in fact, they have adapted to people more than I think most of the other animals that are on this list.
100%. I would say
that I threw together.
Yeah, I know. I would absolutely agree. These are ones that it might also be because humans are very accepting, I feel like, of this particular animal, because we think they're really, really cute and we think that they're funny. And they have little hands, like when they go to wash, you know, they wash their food, they do all these things. And they do that. I will say they don't have opposable thumbs though, like our opossum does on its back feet. So I have a weird competition sometimes with opossums and raccoons in my head. I feel like opossums.
Yeah, they have like these little like fingers and they don't have a thumb, and it's like little thin, weird fingers.
Yeah, so when you see their tracks, it does look just like a little person's hand up in the front. And then in the back, you're gonna have this heel part that's obviously a little longer. Again, I can say from working with them very, very up close, they are smart. Working with them and feeding them and kind of having these interactions with them. When you do touch their hands are actually very soft. It does feel like a person's hand, which is odd sometimes. And for example, you can hold food out and he'll, you know, again, this is specifically working with a raccoon that is considered non-releasable that we are permitted to have because he unfortunately cannot survive in the wild due to unfortunate circumstance with injury. In his particular case, he was orphaned, taken into a rehabilitation center, recovered, he was released successfully, they thought, but then within like 24 hours, he was severely beat up by another troop of raccoons is who they think it was in return. And he's now missing like the majority of his tail and was severely damaged that way. So now that's why he lives under human care with people. This particular raccoon, because he was not accepted by another troop and they almost killed him. And so he lives with us. I say us as in the museum, the Natural History Museum that we have. But again, I cannot emphasize enough, they are not pet animals. As much as you would love for them to be, they are not. It can just lead to so many issues. Try not to do your best to not make your local raccoon, your neighborhood raccoons. They are not your pets either. I promise you they can get their food just fine. They don't need your extra intervention that way.
Just leave the lid off your garbage can. They're fine.
Yeah, just you don't even have to leave the lid off. They'll get in there.
Yeah, they'll get in there. They're good. They
got it. Remember, they're highly adaptable. They don't need our help. They don't need that extra intervention from us. And we also have to remember, we want their diet, you know, to remain pretty okay. And humans eat a lot of things that they naturally would never, that raccoons would naturally never have access to. So even keeping our garbage cans closed, you know, it's going to help them have a healthier diet versus, you know, eating whatever it is that we might have in our trash can.
They'll develop a fondness for Cheetos, and then that will change that animal completely.
Yeah, we can't lose the raccoon we have now, you know, due to Cheeto dust. But yeah, but no, so they're cool animals. They are highly adaptable. But right, because they have that love for them that is very easy for humans to kind of accept and take that way, it also runs into those potential problems, right? Of, wow, you're so cute, I really want you to come in and be my pet. Wow, you're so cute, I really want you to always come up to my porch. And that's when you're going to start to have those conflicts, because that raccoon sees you as a food dispenser, not as, it does not have the love for you that you might have for it. Like, I work with a lot of the wildlife that I work with, including I work with crows also. And people, this is another thing people feel about with crows as well, because they are so clever and smart that you want them to like you. I have an extreme amount of love for the crows that I work with. However, the crows would sell me to Satan for a corn chip immediately. They do not care about me the same way I care about them, right? That love, this is whenever we are applying this human emotion to wildlife, it's called anthropomorphism. And so when you're an educator, that can either be helpful or really harmful. In the case of some species that usually people are grossed out by or more nervous about, like opossums or spiders, snakes, things like that, applying those human emotions, like giving them a name, saying, they're scared, they're this, talking about them in more of a human element, that can be beneficial. That can cause people to empathize more with that animal. When you have animals or species like raccoons or even coyotes, where humans, usually they think that they're cuter, fluffier, that they want to touch them, maybe even bears, things like that. When you have that anthropomorphization with those kind of animals, that's when you're going to run into more issues of people thinking they're pets. They could be pets. They want to take them inside as pets. And that either is going to lead to injury on the human end, or more likely injury and oftentimes death, either to improper care or unfortunate, really negative interaction that results in the animal being euthanized. So we want to make sure, like, when we talk about them, we can appreciate them, but again, just don't touch them. Just leave them alone. Remember that they are wild animals. We want them to stay that way. I love the ability to work with the animals and the wildlife that I work with, but remember, a lot of the times that I'm working with them is because they're considered non-releasable, either because people illegally took them in for wildlife trade and they've lived only under human care, or they've been injured by people. And it's usually always by people, whether it's, car strikes, things like that. Sometimes it's orphans, but then also, when you have like habitat loss, a lot of times the reason that they're here is because of human action in one way or another. So if we, with anything, I always have to, have that disclaimer of, like, even though we can talk about how much we love them and how much we love them, we still want to make sure that it's from a distance and we're not taking any of these animals home. They are living out their life in the wild. We are not giving them our cat's food. We're not doing anything like that. I promise you they will be more than fine, especially when you have adaptable animals like raccoons that way. So that
if you want something to look at you as a food source and then treat you with cold indifference, just get a cat. It's the same.
Yeah, same thing. Yeah, but that one you're allowed to have in your house
Yeah.
without any issues, right? That one's acceptable. But yeah, so if anything, of all the animals that we talked about, any of them, just really, all in all, from a distance, you'll be all right. You'll be all right, and then the animal will be able to be all right also, because we want to protect them as well, not just ourselves.
Yeah. So I think that'll just about wrap us up for the day. Do you have any last minute tips for people who, are out in the field working with animals, who want to work with animals or anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I do in particular, I'm considered an education specialist. So I focus mainly on how do we teach about wildlife or other natural resources. I'm a certified interpretive guide. And so it's my job basically to kind of talk about them that way. So if you're interested in specifically what I do, you can always find institutions near you, whether they are museums, zoos, parks, nature centers, things like that, and try to start. I always recommend volunteering first. The reason I say that is because oftentimes my job sounds, I love my job and it sounds really cool, but it is not meant for everybody. There are a lot of stressors and difficulties that you don't always get to, that people don't always see. It's one of those jobs that sounds super cool, that you're just teaching about animals all day. But it's definitely not everyone's cup of tea the way that they think it might be. So I always recommend volunteering first, making sure like, I really like this, this is something I really want to do. And during that, you can try to pursue positions, as an educator, as a naturalist. If you're starting out and you're not even in school yet, and you want to try to pursue a degree, you can always look into degrees. My degree, I have a BS of Forest Resources from the University of Georgia. I majored in Parks, Recreation, and Tourism Management and got a certificate in environmental education. Prior to being Parks, Rec, and Tourism, I was a wildlife studies student. The reason that I switched was because while both degrees focused on forest resources, wildlife management techniques, and overall general knowledge, the benefit that I got from the Parks, Recreation, and Tourism was understanding the human dimensions component, and not just wildlife, but how human beings interact with wildlife. And obviously that's very important in what I do with my job. So I am extremely specialized in what I do, and I like to think that I do it well through, experience and kind of training that way. So depending on what you want to do, if you want to do more education, you can pursue a degree similar to that. Sometimes people want to go into more research, or even into rehabilitation. And so if you wanted to go into more research, I always recommend trying your best to get a science degree of some kind, whether it's biology or ecology or whatever. If you have wildlife sciences, zoology, something like that, that can help set you up for research. You can always look into joining labs at your university or in that kind of area there to get started there. If you are somebody who's interested in working with rehab wildlife, whether it's through kind of education or getting some of that experience, I will also tell you another one of those things that sounds wonderful, but can be really hard on your heart. Working with rehabbed animals, they do not always make it. And you see some really sad cases sometimes. The majority of wildlife that I've worked with are rehabilitated animals. I've worked with animals, majority of like larger raptors and birds of prey that I've worked with can't fly, are missing sections of their wings, have been missing eyeballs, have serious damage, again, from vehicle strikes, things like that. A lot of one opossum I worked with, she had been attacked by a dog and was missing a really large chunk of her tail, and had other unfortunate injuries that way. So when you get into this, you also have to kind of remember, you will see some sad things and hear some sad stories. If you work more with medicine and rehabilitation, that can also be hard on your heart also, but it's extremely important and worth doing. And I would always encourage anybody, if they're interested, to try to get involved. You can always use apps or websites like Animal Help Now. What they do is they're able to connect you with any wildlife rehabilitators in your area. So you put your address in or your location and they tell you who's around, which is also super important for everybody to know in case you find an animal that really might need your help. That way you are able to contact somebody and know more about that. So if you're interested in rehabilitation, find one of those clinics there. You can reach out to them about volunteering, or if they ever have positions available that way. But that's a way to kind of get started with it, whether you're interested in education, like I said on my end, whether you're more interested in the research aspect, or you're maybe more interested in the rehabilitation kind of veterinary kind of aspect and rehab aspect that way. But whatever you do, I caution you with this one thing: you should never, ever, 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 ever have to pay somebody else for your experience. Sometimes, unfortunately, institutions or some people want to take advantage of people extremely interested in the field.
We call that college.
Yeah, other than college, right? So if they're like, oh, for this internship, you pay me $3,000. And you're like, don't do that. And they're going to tell you it's going to be great experience. I encourage you right now and implore you, please, please, please do not do that to yourself. There are institutions there that will be accepting, whether it's volunteers or internships. Just don't fall prey to those kind of scams. That is a huge red flag for anybody. If they are either barely paying you, I've heard of some biology that pay you $200 a month and don't give you anywhere to stay or other things like that. Or some programs that I've heard of that want you to pay them a tuition for the sake of the experience, and it's not a degree. It's not in college. It's not anything like that. Just don't do that. You know, I want you to get involved, but I also don't want you to fall prey to kind of scamming kind of things that people do that way that ultimately are not going to help you in the future. But if you ever, for example, if you're in Atlanta, Chattahoochee Nature Center is a wonderful place to try to get involved. That's somewhere that I worked with previously. They have a wonderful group of people there. Appalachian Wildlife Rehabilitation Clinic there. They're wonderful people as well.
Here in Alabama, we have the Alabama Wildlife Center. It's located in Oak Mountain. I definitely recommend that one. Oak Mountain itself is a great site to visit. Auburn University has a great rehabilitation program. And Davy Crockett State Park in Tennessee has a great one also.
Right. So starting to look in those places are great places to start. But yeah, I always recommend people get involved when possible. And even if it's something that I will say careers like this tend to are more often than not seasonal, can be considered unstable and are not the most high. I will never be a rich human being. I will say that. And the amount of full-time opportunities are highly competitive and there's not a lot of them. But so with all of that kind of in mind, I still encourage people to get involved if it's something that you want to do. And if you want to work for it, if you want to go for it, if you ever really want to get like hyped up and feel really good about yourself, Merlin Tuttle is one of my favorite like bat conservationists and researchers. And he has a YouTube video. I think it's like 20 minutes long, but it says like what he wants like young conservationists to know. And it's just this really cool pep talk. And it just makes you feel really good. And he's basically talking about, even if you don't get the best grades, even if this happened, if you care about what you do, that automatically is going to set you above other people. The love that you have for what you do and the way that you're able to communicate it and work through it. And that's going to show and making, hopefully, even though, you know, a lot of conservationists, and I'm sure the same is kind of with archaeologists that way, it's not always respected or valued in the same way that it probably should be, or really should be. Yeah. And to see it glorified a little bit more without the actual support to always back it up, which hopefully is changing as people realize how important some of these things are. And hopefully as this conversation starts a little bit more, but I know on my own social media, I've gone through and shared a lot of my experiences of like what people can try to, how you can get started, places to look, places to kind of where you kind of get started into some of those areas, but just take your time looking. I encourage you, but I always caution people, you never should have to pay for the experience. Don't do that. Don't let them scam you is my one thing. Like, don't do it.
With the exception of college, don't let people scam you. Yes.
Don't do it. Yeah. But
I think that's going to just about wrap us up for the day.
Perfect.
Yeah. This was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. And thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It's fun to get to talk about a lot of wildlife here and hopefully learning some more about them. And I know especially with things like copperheads and water moccasins will make people feel a little bit less nervous. Even if you do get bit again, like odds are you'll be all right. And remembering just the golden rule of respect them from a distance and we'll be all right. So